Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's had a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just gonna get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so, just down below. If you like the content you see, don't forget to give a like. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's a comment section down there as well for all of that. Today we are diving back into the Ghostly Echoes series. We had been working our way through British Columbia, so now we are going east. We're skipping over Alberta because we already did that one. And we are diving into the ghost stories of Saskatchewan. So I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Bienfait, Saskatchewan, the curse of the McKees. Andy McKee had no fond memories of his grandfather, but he would admit that the man could tell a story. And when Andy was growing up lonely and bored on an isolated, drought-ravaged farm east of Bienfait, that must have been a quality to appreciate. When Grandfather McKee was in a rare amicable mood, he would fire Andy's imagination with colorful accounts of the famous buffalo hunts. His vivid descriptions belied the fact that by the time he had seen the prairies, the buffalo had been hunted nearly to extinction. Andy enjoyed the stories anyway. Grandfather's repertoire of tall tales also included stories of the Northwest Rebellion, and Andy knew that these had at least some basis in fact. The elder McKee had come west to help fight down the Riel's uprising. With each retelling of his adventure, however, the number of Métis he boasted of having killed grew larger. In Val Clary's book, Ghost Stories of Canada, Andy McKee describes a grandfather of a cankerous, wicked old bastard who dismissed the Métis people of stinking heathens, and revealing his Orangeman nature, dirty Baptists. Indeed, the old man may have had few endearing qualities, but his racism simply identified him as a product of his time. In 1885, when McKee came west with the militia, violent anti-Indian sentiment had reached its peak. In the April 23, 1885 edition of the Saskatchewan Herald, one article laments the news that nearly a score of our citizens have been slain without a moment's warning by ingrates whose interests they guarded as carefully as they did their own, and whose hands were daily opened in charity to the men they looked upon as unfortunate and to be pitied. Evidently, the Métis people legitimate land claims were not among the aforementioned guarded interests. A few inches away on the same newspaper page, it is concluded that this gives weight to an old adage that the only good Indians are the dead ones. It was in this climate of hatred that McKee met the West, and he lowered himself to the occasion admirably. Following the rebellion, he took out a homestead claim on the farm near Bienfait. When he discovered a Métis family stubbornly squatting by the THRU River on his land, he employed a swift, pragmatic solution. He shot them all and buried the bodies where they fell. It may have been that nobody knew what happened on the isolated farm, or it may have been that nobody cared. Whatever the reason, no form of earthly justice was ever meted out for the crime. McKee's new life on the prairies did not prove to be an easy one. He married and had a son, but his wife died soon after the boy's birth. The land itself seemed turned against him. With year after dry year, when the topsoil simply blew away, the seasons of horrible blight, when it didn't. Eventually his son married, and in 1916, Andy was born. But barely a year later, the young mother died in childbirth. A newborn daughter also perished. This tragedy left 3 generations of McKee men to fend for themselves. Andy's father worked in the nearby coal mines from August through March, and farmed the family's stubborn quarter section the rest of the year. Economic necessity had him toiling long hours, no matter what the season. As a result, Andy was raised primarily by his grandfather. It was a bleak existence for a boy, worsened by the fact of his grandfather's personality. And if Andy's poverty-beset rural life wasn't restrictive enough, the old man had a rigid rule that even limited the boy's harmless daytime wanderings. He was never to set foot on the bottom land near the river. The McKee farm was divided into two sections by a bluff, a sharp drop of 100 feet that led to the valley of the THRU River. The soil down there was a little richer and tended not to dry out as badly. The McKees might have fared better as farmers had they worked the bottom land, but the old man expressly forbade it. To ensure that his warning was heeded, he threatened that should they ever disregard his wishes, he would banish his son from the farm and give Andy the beating of his life. For years, everyone kept to the high ground, and confrontation on the issue was avoided. In 1930, farmers in the WIP and Chat area were feeling the harsh sting of the Depression. Andy's father was forced to spend more hours working for less, and in a reversal of roles, 14-year-old Andy began caring for his failing grandfather. Perhaps the increasing dreariness of his life called for some adventure. Perhaps it was easier to disobey a feeble old man in his 70s, or perhaps it was the rebellion of adolescence. But Andy decided one day to explore the bottomland. There was a gully where he knew he could climb down the cliff, and Andy's heart was beating with excitement as he approached it. It was a hot, dry August day, and the thought of sitting on the forbidden riverbank and splashing his bare feet in the THRUs held great appeal. Andy had taken fewer than a half-dozen steps down the hill, however, when he was overcome with dread. It wasn't fear of his grandfather. The old man could no longer walk as far as the bluff. It was a sense that this was a bad place, a poisoned place, and Andy no longer wanted his summer afternoon adventure. The awful feeling refused to leave him, yet Andy felt compelled to finish his journey. He was sweating from the fear more than the heat. By the time he reached the river, terribly, unexplainably upset, he began to shiver and weep, and as he walked down toward the gully, in the shadows that bled from the bottom of the cliff, Andy saw him, a tall, dark man with piercing eyes. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a fringed buckskin jacket, and as Andy stared in shock, the man raised his arm and pointed accusingly. He was pointing at Andy. Suddenly the boy was surrounded with loud echoing sounds and held the certain knowledge that if he stayed, he would die. He scrambled up the side of the hill, praying desperately that he would reach safety before whatever lived in the bottomland could reach him. He made it, and on shaky legs returned to the house. Andy never looked behind him and vowed he would never set foot on the bottomland again. Having had enough trouble for the day, he didn't even mention the incident to his grandfather. Andy made dinner for them both, and then went to bed early as the elder McKee sat at the kitchen table poring over his Bible. What followed was the worst nightmare of Andy's young life, a heart-stopping experience he described to Val Clary. Terrifying though that day had been for me, the night was 1,000 times worse. Immediately, I was lost in a nightmare. I could see myself lying down at the foot of this bluff. It was dark, and the darkness was full of bellowing animals and shouts and guns being fired. I couldn't move, and I was splattered with dung and blood. All around me, great hairy bodies were thudding down, and I was certain that I was going to be crushed and buried. It was what my granddad had told me about so often, the Buffalo Run, and I was going to be killed. Andy awoke, drenched with sweat, his throat parched from screaming. He must have wondered why he hadn't woken his grandfather, but when the boy ventured to the kitchen for a dipper of water, it became obvious. Andy's grandfather was dead. The flickering lamplight showed him still propped in the kitchen's chair, his head resting on the Bible and his eyes staring vacantly ahead. One generation of the McKee men was gone. It took every penny that Andy's father had to give the old man a decent burial. And as the Depression raged on, that little bit of security cash was impossible to replace. 1931 was the McKees' most devastating year. Little snow in the winter and no rain through the spring and summer rendered their dusty farm unable to produce even enough vegetables to feed the two of them. Often there was no gas for the truck, and therefore no way to take advantage of free food and clothing brought to Benefat on occasional relief trains from the east, and at the coal mines, which had always been a reliable, if back-breaking, source of income. Serious labor trouble was brewing. The crushing conditions of the Great Depression put both miners and mine operators under debilitating economic pressure. Top market prices for lignite, a soft coal, had dropped by more than 25%, and wages fell as a result. Men were working up to 16 hours a day and claimed they were not getting true weights for the coal they mined. Worse, what little money they were making did not seem to be truly theirs, as they were forced to deal with the company's stores. The situation volatilized, and by September 7, 1931, every mining company in Estevan to Benefat area except the THRU was on strike. Both sides were unyielding, and as numerous conciliatory efforts failed, mine operators surged the Saskatchewan government to provide ample police protection for their property and equipment. As hostilities grew, so did the ranks of the RCMP in Estevan. On September 29, the day of a planned labor demonstration, there was at least 85 red serge uniforms lined up along 4th Street. Andy's father felt it was important to stand with his fellow workers, so on the day of the demonstration he walked all the way into Benefat to catch a ride. It was shortly after noon when they assembled, some 400 miners and their families, to begin their fateful march into Estevan. That morning, Estevan's town council had passed a resolution refusing to grant a parade permit, and it was a useless gesture in the face of the miners' determination. They marched on peacefully until the Estevan chief of police approached, ordering them to leave town. There was a heated exchange of words and a single violent gesture that started the melee. For 45 minutes, the miners and the police clashed in a bloody riot that was to claim 3 young lives and stained the history books. It was September 29, 1931, from that point forward, known as Black Tuesday. McKee managed to dodge the bullets and rocks. He avoided arrest and walked over 25 exhausting miles back to the farm. But when he got there, Andy could see that he was a broken man. There was surely no hope for decent employment now, and the McKees' very survival was at stake. The next day, a Saskatchewan newspaper devoted their front pages to listing the injured and the dead. Andy's father made a decision. He told his son that if they didn't want to freeze to death that winter, they'd have to go for out some coal. It was a common practice in the area for people to dig small holes along a seam of coal and help themselves to what they found. Andy's dad had been mining long enough to know where the coal was on his land. It ran along the riverbank in the bottomland. Andy begged his father not to do it, insisting that the old man had been right. It was a bad place, a haunted place. His father just laughed and called it Irish superstition. Since the elder McKee was dead and no longer able to kick them off the land, he was going to do what was necessary. He gathered his pick and shovel and asked once more whether Andy was going to help him. Andy shook his head and helplessly watched his father walk down over the bluff. It was the last time Andy would see him alive. The boy waited for what seemed like an eternity, but his father didn't come home. Finally, at dusk, Andy headed for the gully that he knew would take him down to the riverbed. The shadows were darkening by the minute. Andy called for his dad again and again, but received no answer. Truly, he didn't expect one. He knew what had been down there waiting for his father in the bottomland. Strangely enough, Andy felt no fear as he began to descend the bluff. As he said in Clary's book, he was certain of what he'd find. The bushes right below here were crushed flat. My dad's body hardly looked human. It was so crushed and broken and torn. There was no face left, and the smell, it was what I'd smelled in my nightmare. Blood and dung, and the hot bodies of animals. The pick and shovel lay on the ground. They touched no coal in the riverbank that day. Instead, Andy McKee used them to bury the remains of his father in the bottomland. When he finished the somber chore and looked up, he saw the tall figure of the Métis man watching from the shadows. Andy felt no fear, though. His grandfather had murdered the Métis family, but his father trampled under the hoofs of 1,000 ghostly bisons, had paid the debt. Andy tossed the tools into the bushes and walked back up to the top of the gully. He didn't stop there to reflect, but kept walking. He didn't stop at the house, but kept walking. Andy walked most of the night until he reached Estevan. There he jumped a freight train to Toronto, leaving behind forever his cursed existence on the dusty southeastern Saskatchewan farm. This story takes place in Sinnet, Saskatchewan. Strange sights on Sinnet Road. It was February 1938, and a young man named Jerry walked along Sinnet Road one evening, on his way to play penny Nate poker with some friends. He was bundled against the cold, his boots crunching in the snow. It was a lonely sound breaking the frosty silence. Sinnet Road ran past a cemetery, and as Jerry came closer to it, he could see a man in the distance approaching. That must be Keller, he thought, expecting it to be a local fellow who wanted to join in the game. He called out a greeting. The man showed no sign of hearing Jerry, but continued to walk towards him. Jerry must have thought his words were lost on the wind, and tried speaking to his friend again. Again there was no reply. When Jerry was directly in front of the cemetery, and the man he thought to be his friend was no more than 20 yards away, he called out to him one last time. "Hey, Keller," he shouted. But the words were barely past his lips before he knew he had made a mistake. Not only was this not Mr. Keller, it was not any ordinary person. As Jerry's words hung in the cold night air, the man who had been walking towards him transformed, unbelievably, into a huge fireball which flew up high over the cemetery gate and telephone wires, then descended, still flaming, and disappeared among the tombstones. Jerry still attended the night's poker game, but chances are he didn't play. His friends reported that he walked in the door, looking as white as the snow outside. He was shaking violently and couldn't speak for quite some time. Once Jerry did talk, however. This was the tale he told. Decades later, his story lives on as one of the legends of Sinnet Road. Imagine yourself driving northbound on Sinnet Road late at night. You see car lights approaching and watch them disappear as the southbound driver enters the gully, just beyond the bridge. You watch the car's headlights reflecting off cloud cover in the sky. As it climbs the hill on its way towards you, you pull over as far as possible, hoping the shoulder's not too soft, and dim your lights knowing that you're about to meet the other vehicle. But as you crest the hill, the small valley comes into full view before you. You're shocked to discover that you're alone on this dark stretch of narrow country road. This is the ghost car of Sinnet Road. Time after time, people reported having this strange encounter. These accounts may have been disregarded, but tracks in the mud or snow frequently offered proof, at least, of the storyteller's conviction. Because Sinnet Road was so narrow and poorly maintained, pulling over meant taking the risk of getting stuck. You only did it if you were sure, very sure, of meeting another vehicle. The next time you see approaching headlights wink out behind a hill or a stand of trees, imagine that the ghost car of Sinnet Road is coming your way. It was around 10 o'clock one winter evening in the late 1970s, and Jim and Doris Belger's pseudonyms, son Peter had just arrived home from high school volleyball practice. Although he appeared to be fine physically, he had come in the house trembling and pale and was now pacing the floor frantically, mumbling to himself and peering cautiously out the windows. He was terrified, Doris later said, and it took a while for him to tell us why. When Peter was calm enough to speak, he told his parents that he'd been driving up Sinnet Road towards the farm when he saw a thing come up out of the ditch. He slowed the car and tried to get a better view. When Peter was close enough to see the creature, it dashed across the road in front of him, illuminated briefly by the car's headlights. "And what was it?" Doris and Jim asked breathlessly. Peter answered, "A big hairy man." There was a beat of silence, following Peter's dramatic disclosure. Then his parents burst into laughter. "Oh, for heaven's sakes, Peter," gasped his mother. "You should have stopped. Maybe somebody ran out of gas and needed your help." Making light of the situation should have made Peter realize that his teenage imagination had simply overtaken his common sense. But instead, he became more upset, screaming, "You won't laugh when you're murdered in your own bed tonight." Seeing his obvious fear and knowing that their son was usually a level-headed boy, the Belgers began to take his story seriously. They complied when he insisted upon calling the neighbors, warning them to lock their doors, and they locked and barred their own. Still that night, Peter insisted upon taking a hunting knife into the bedroom he shared with his brother. Cool heads often prevail in the light of day, and by the next morning, Jim and Doris Belger were quite convinced that Peter had suffered nothing more than an encounter with a black bear and a fitful night's sleep. Indeed, he seemed calmer, although he refused to accept his parents' rational explanations. "I know what I saw," he insisted. "It was like a monster, a big hairy man with a hunched back." And so the matter was dropped, at least for a couple of days, until a particular news item on the radio caught the family's interest. Apparently, there had been a Sasquatch sighted just over 100 miles east of the Belger farm near Theodore. Of course, the reporter had assembled the facts and deduced it was a Sasquatch. The witness, it seems, could only describe it as a big, hairy man. This story takes place in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Toddler haunts Duplex. If Debbie had not been such a particular housekeeper, it might have taken her longer to realize that the basement suite she moved into was haunted. But in her words, everything has its place in Debbie's house. So when things were frequently out of place, she noticed. "When I first moved in, I hardly spent any time there," Debbie admits. But it seemed that every day, when she returned to her apartment, something was out of order. Once, after being away for a weekend, Debbie came home to a frustratingly large mess. Cassette tapes had been carefully filed or randomly mixed. All the lights in the house had been unplugged, and there was sticky juice spilled on the kitchen floor. Irritated, she asked her upstairs neighbors and friends, Gary and Laurie, about the incident. "Not to be rude," Debbie said, "but did you let your kids play down here when I'm gone?" They looked at each other blankly, confused by the question. It seems Debbie had the only key. When Debbie began spending more time in the apartment, strange things began to happen right before her eyes. Lights would switch on and off by themselves. The television would come on in the middle of the night. A hot water tap that could only be turned on with pliers would start running on its own. And every time Debbie would sit down to read, she'd feel someone's icy breath on her shoulder. After a while, she dreaded going home because she never knew what was going to happen. Laurie and Gary were beginning to notice some out-of-ordinary occurrences as well. There would be audible footsteps and water running in the basement suite when they knew Debbie wasn't home. And one night they switched off the television and lights at about 1 o'clock before retiring. Just as they were drifting off to sleep, however, they were startled by noises in the living room. Gary went out there expecting to confront a burglar and found the TV had been turned back on. One night, after witnessing a flurry of paranormal activity, 3 friends desperately appealed to the police for help. The only assistance found there was a suggestion to call a priest. "We never did," said Laurie, acknowledging the difficulty of finding reputable help in that situation. "I mean, who are you going to call, Ghostbusters?" Because of the mischievous nature of many of the incidents, Debbie has always had a hunch the ghost was a child. One afternoon, frustrated with the flashing lights and cold spots in her apartment, she went upstairs to share her theory. "Was there ever a child who died in this place?" she asked. "I just feel like it's a little kid who's stuck between here and there." Gary and Laurie had a friend sitting at the kitchen table that day. He suddenly went white. It turned out that the man's 2-year-old niece had been struck and killed by a car in front of the duplex years before. The Toddler's family had lived in the basement suite that Debbie now occupied. Somewhat bolstered by the knowledge, Debbie went downstairs to talk to the ghost. "Don't do this to me," she demanded. "I know who you are and I'm not afraid of you." The apartment was calmer for a short period after that. The truth was, though, that Debbie was still quite afraid. She found it difficult to brave it for her 12-year-old daughter when inside she herself was terrified of the force that occupied her home. Debbie wasn't the only person who sensed that this could be a very negative and frightening entity. She has relatives who were native and, according to Debbie, more sensitive in spiritual matters. Many of them wouldn't set foot in her home. One uncle mustered the courage to visit twice, then firmly refused to return. He later confided in Debbie that he felt distinctively unwelcomed by the spirit. "There were the smells too," said Debbie, sudden sense of either lilac or burnt toast. "They were so strong they could make me nauseous." There were no lilac trees close to the duplex, and Debbie never wore perfume. As for the burnt toast, the last time she smelled it was just before she moved, and her toaster had been packed away for 3 days. Could it have been from upstairs? "Not likely. Laurie and Gary were away," Debbie explained. Debbie was able to explain away those smells for a while. She was pregnant while she lived in the duplex and thought that perhaps they were some sort of odd symptom. That was later disproved, but while her pregnancy didn't cause the perception of the smells, it did seem to affect the amount of paranormal activity that happened. It increased steadily as her pregnancy progressed. Debbie was facing a difficult personal decision with this pregnancy. She was in the process of a divorce, and her soon-to-be ex-husband was the father of the child. She had a promising future with a wonderful new man she had met, but wondered how he would accept the baby. She considered giving it up for adoption to give everyone a clean start, but it was a wrenching decision. Debbie had earlier in life given the baby to adoptive parents, and she always kept a picture of this newborn infant on the wall. While she struggled with her problem, the baby's picture kept falling off the wall. Stubbornly, Debbie kept putting it back up, each time with a more formidable nail. Pretty soon, she said, I was using a spike to keep it up there. But the picture continued to fall. Eventually, Debbie chose to keep her baby no matter what the consequences. From that point on, the other child's photo stayed put with a thumbtack. Once the baby was born, Debbie always had the sensation of being watched. The spirit seemed to be fascinated with the baby too, and paid a great deal of attention to it. The automatic swing Debbie had for her newborn would switch on and off by itself, and Debbie swears that her baby could see the present that was invisible to her. The infant would coo and talk continuously when by herself. When Debbie held her daughter and tried to get her attention, the child always seemed to be focusing on something just behind her mother's left shoulder. After they left the duplex, however, the baby would always make eye contact. It was one particularly disturbing incident that cemented Debbie's decision to move. She was in the living room one day while her baby napped in the bedroom. Suddenly there was a loud, continuous banging noise, and Debbie ran to investigate. What she saw will stay with her forever. The big teddy bear that she had put in bed with her daughter was being slammed repeatedly against the side of the crib. The baby's fingers were curled around the stuffed animal's foot, but she could hardly be held responsible. She was only 2 weeks old at the time, an infant with neither the strength nor physical skills to commit such an act. Debbie knew then that for the safety of her baby and her older daughter, she had to leave the duplex. Things really started acting up then, she said. Every time Debbie would begin packing, she'd be overwhelmed by a feeling of suffocation and being forced to stop. She felt that the ghosts had been furious over their leaving. When she started to move furniture of the suite, Debbie refused to sleep there at night, fearing the spirit would be angry enough to kill the baby. On the first night in her new home, however, there was another scare. I could see these flashing lights, and I was going, oh no, not again. Happily, the phenomenon was caused by nothing more ghostly than a flashlight with a short in its wiring. Laurie and Gary chose to move out of the duplex at the same time. Now Debbie is happily remarried, and both couples remain close friends and live within a short walk of each other and the duplex they used to share. They've gone through a lot of tenants since we left, observes Debbie, and adds that she still has to walk past her old home occasionally. How does it make her feel? It gives me the creeps. An understatement if there ever was one.